Whenever you lot are ready, let's go.
All right, sweet.
Cool. So hello everyone, welcome to the Future of Accessibility panel as part of Orchard's conference of panels discussing the club scene and the various aspects of it within Leeds. So when we talk about accessibility, what we're really talking about here then is the various mechanisms and ways in which we can make club scenes, party spaces more accessible to people with disabilities, people who identify as disabled, both physically, but also kind of non-physically, so including here neurodivergent conditions and mental health conditions. So hopefully on the panel tonight, we'll not just talk about kind of what we might understand as the kind of bare bones of accessibility, so the very basics of what we can be doing to help disabled people in our spaces, but also going beyond that and kind of really talking about what accessibility could really mean and how we could really reimagine a lot of clubbing spaces if we were talking about accessibility in a really kind of disabled-led way. So yeah, without further ado, I'll invite the wonderful panelists who have been assembled for tonight. Would you like to kind of go down the line and introduce yourselves?
Okay. Hello. I'm Dman Leeds. I run a local night called Dman and Friends. We try and make a small part of the Leeds nightlife a little bit more accessible, specifically to neurodivergent people and people with Asperger's spectrum disorder and people with Down syndrome. I'm from Leeds. I've lived here all my life and just generally get invited to do fun stuff and thought-provoking stuff like this.
So my name's Maeve. I perform under the name Gordian Stimm. So I make just like weird, noisy, blown out, overcompressed pop music. I also play drums for a bunch of bands. I play drums for the emo band I Told You I Would Eat You, and also for Joshua Zero as well. And I also, in this kind of context, I work with Andrew Dman from Natural Selection, and we basically try to make it our business to make kind of positive parties, more accessible kind of like club spaces. That's kind of part of what we do. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that.
Hi, I'm Ali King. I DJ around Leeds. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with a kind of half cyst, half tumour in my ear. Recently got discharged from hospital, but that was after like 12 years. So when I've been like going out for uni and stuff, I've been very passionate about how we can make that more accessible for students and club goers in general.
Very good. So thank you for that. So I remembered as I was going down the line that I'm not sure I introduced myself, so if I didn't, my name is Geller, or Mandy and Friends, if you're paying me. So good to know that we have a good diversity here of kind of genres and places in Leeds that we're kind of trying to make accessible. So the first thing I really wanted to focus on was kind of what we actually do see happening in terms of accessibility. So when I started organising a night with Sayang and Kessie, if people know who they are, called Flesh and Tension, and the whole idea of that was we wanted to make a kind of fetish kink night for trans and non-binary people and people of colour. And the whole ethos behind that I wanted to introduce was a kind of green light system that would help people with social anxiety, people with autism spectrum disorder, and generally people who don't feel that comfortable in club spaces, feeling that they had a way of signalling to people around them, whether they wanted loads of people to be talking to them, whether they wanted just to literally be with the friends they'd come with, etc., etc. And so I guess I'm wondering from your experience, both in the events you run and you've taken part of, and that you've gone to and have participated in, what kind of accessibility methods do you kind of see being implemented around Leeds, and kind of how successful do you think they are being in kind of making party spaces more accessible?
So I think it's one of those things you see, especially over I've been going out in Leeds now for about 7, 8 years since I was 16, 17, and incrementally I've seen a lot of great changes come to this scene. You see more wheelchair accessibility being put into venues. You see more, more kind of like policing of really intense lights or really intense sound systems. You see more safe space policies put in place. You see more lots of really great incremental changes that do make the Leeds scene into a much friendlier place. But there's also still, I don't know, I think a lot of that has been very successful for a lot of different minority groups around Leeds, and into making the Leeds scene a lot more inclusionary rather than exclusionary. But I think we still have quite a way to go. Even what we do with like Dman and Friends, it's so contextual to the venue that we use. If we use a venue where like there isn't a ramp, or where there's a heavy sound system in place, or where it's all so contextual. And if you can't afford to book a venue that is fully accessible, and that is, if you're like a small promoter or whatever, it's to some degree an impossibility. There's only so much you can put in your place yourself without building a venue from the ground up, kind of thing.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because it kind of illustrates how, in kind of one sense, where smaller promoters like yourself with Dman and Friends, like there's not, while you know there is the kind of like the power there of being able to like have your own event and stuff like that, but it's not like you've got a massive amount of like resources to it, and it's almost kind of difficult when you're trying to like build that kind of thing with the ground up, when you kind of look at like other venues and like larger promotion companies that do have like actual money behind them, that kind of like don't seem to be like massively into making spaces as accessible as they possibly could. I mean, that's kind of what we've been trying to do really hard with Natural Selection, is kind of making sure that we kind of like take a step back and like kind of recontextualize what like accessibility means, and not as if, you know, not just in the sense of like, are there stairs? It's more about taking a step back and being like, oh, right, okay, so like we've got these acts, we've got this kind of music, whatever, like, but who is this going to keep out? Like, instead of who is this for, like, who is this going to keep out, and how can we bring those kinds of people in? I think that's something that we've kind of been trying to do, something that Andrew has been really, really good at doing, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think there's a lot of like anti-discrimination policies in place around Leeds. Most bars and clubs have access to earplugs, albeit only foam ones, but it's like a good step. But I think when people think about accessibility, they think on such a like small spectrum of like, is it wheelchair accessible? But disability is like so many different things, and I assume it would be so hard to think of everything, but I don't think that always the work is being put into place to have people that actually experience it. Like some of the sound volumes around these are absolutely horrendous, and it is the foam earplugs. Some places they don't have them, but I think a lot of places do try. Like Older Bus Station, they're pretty good with like, they have the ramp and they've got the disabled toilet downstairs, which is better than most of the clubs that we go to. Really, it's not accessible at all. So there are places that make small changes, but there's not many places that are completely accessible in Leeds, or really anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things I really liked there was that there was this real current of, there is a real debate that happens where at some levels there is actually quite a lot of consensus around accessibility, that we should be trying to bring in groups who have been excluded. But there is, at some other level, at the kind of higher level, right, the kind of bigger level, this kind of pressure not to, based around the idea of resources. So do we have the money to put that in? Do we have the space to put that in? And all that stuff. And I think that is often sometimes used to really like curtail discussions of accessibility. You know, so a lot of people really will really rush to kind of suggest that, well, building a ramp would be so expensive that we can't possibly do it. But what, you know, history tends to prove is that when enough, you know, kind of grassroots pressure is actually applied to make that kind of venue, make that space, build a ramp, they will. So one of the examples I know of this in Leeds is the Parkinson's building by the Uni of Leeds. So they, for years, refused to build a ramp, basically until there was so much kind of pressure from within that they kind of ended up having to build one. Oh, see, this is what I told you earlier. This is what I told you about the dyspraxia jumping in. So
they've got that swanky lift now.
And that's it. And the great thing about that swanky lift is that they said that the reason why they couldn't build a ramp was because there was no way to build an accessibility like way into an accessible way into the building without making it kind of different from without making it different from the kind of aesthetic of the building, and then they chose like an awful Art Deco like Art Deco panelled lift, which you got to imagine that conversations were being had on that. So with the next question, then I want to kind of take this discussion of resources and kind of lift it a little bit and kind of give you free reign of a venue. So imagine, if you will, that you've all been given a club space and you can do with it whatever you would like. You can change all of the walls, you can have anything put in you want, you can have anything taken out you want, you can put in a gauche Art Deco lift if you want. It's really up to you. So I guess, what would you choose to do? And I guess, how do you think that would affect groups who you feel like are or are not currently included, or as you said, maybe excluded from party scenes? Can we start with you?
Yeah, so I mean, if I was kind of given complete, in this imaginary scenario, do I have like an unlimited budget?
No.
Okay.
You have £100.
I have £100. Okay, cool.
No, you have a limited budget.
So I'm going to get a taxi to the airport. So in this kind of scenario, I guess, if I kind of had complete free reign, I suppose, not to repeat myself, but it would kind of be like a situation where I'd be looking at like, right, okay, how can I get like as many people from as many different kind of like subsets, not looking at an event and be like, well, I can't do that kind of thing. Because I think that's probably like the main thing that's at stake here. People who, everybody has a right to be able to go and participate in these spaces, but not everybody has the ability to, obviously. So it's kind of, I would first look at the actual physical space of it and work out, obviously, like all the kind of basics of it. Like, is it wheelchair accessible? Is it going to be, like a space where people feel comfortable in? Is it going to be claustrophobic? What about fire exits? Is it going to be a situation where you're going to have, are there going to be like blind spots in certain places? Am I going to need to have CCTV? Will that then affect like, people who do or don't want to be like captured on video kind of thing? There's so much stuff to consider in that way. But for me personally, I think I would just kind of work on the ability of just having like a ground floor space, something that's like nice and open, something that's aerated, something that isn't like a tiny little sweatbox. Like, I spend most of my life on tour playing like toilet circuit venues, getting wet and wild behind the drum kit. And like, I can't tell you how important air conditioning in venues is. Holy shit. But yeah, that's probably the main thing that I would focus on, just trying to kind of strike that balance between getting a space that is like exciting and invigorating to be in, because you don't want to go so far with your kind of accessibility requirements that it ends up feeling like a kind of like tokenistic, like, oh, you have accessibility needs, so like this is your space kind of thing. Like, no, like every space should kind of be like that. It should still be like a kind of like cool, nice place to be, but just not keeping anybody out kind of thing. That was a little bit rambly. Did all that make sense? Is that? Oh, cool, I'm seeing nods. All right, cool, sweet.
I think as well, like bouncers and bar staff for me, I think that's a really big thing, like proper training in disability that goes above and beyond first aid, like knowing what people need when they need it, and realizing that someone might not be responding in a certain way to what you're used to, but that doesn't mean that they're overly drunk or that like you need to kick them out, and making sure that, especially like there's been some real horror stories about people that have ended up in those situations. That would be a really big thing for me. Another would be, there's a really great night called Deaf Rave who put on raves for deaf people.
Fuck it.
And have you ever heard of sub packs? It's like a backpack and you wear it and they're bassy, and they like give them out, you can wear them, you can feel the music. They have like big subs everywhere that you can feel the music with, stuff like that. Yeah,
I love that.
So fun. But when I first learned how to DJ, it wasn't through listening, because at the time I was hard of hearing. It was through like feeling it, and it's different, but it makes it a lot easier. I recommend feeling the sub when you DJ, because you can feel the kick. But like stuff like that, so you can be more involved in it. I think that would be ideal for me.
I just want to quickly come in on that, because I think that's a really excellent thing, not just thinking here about accessibility for the kind of people going to parties, but thinking about accessibility in terms of the people playing at them too. Because so I have autism. I don't know why I said that as if like some fabulous thing.
You're so
Cool. Could you pass me that pack? Yeah. Cheers. So I have autism, which means that sometimes when I hear multiple things of different volumes at different speeds coming into my ears, I get like very overwhelmed very quickly. And so you might be thinking, then why and how did you ever learn to DJ, which is in many ways exclusively listening to things at different speeds and sounds. And the truth is that I see DJs all the time, so they have a visual component which helps me isolate it sensorially. So again, not doing it through hearing, which I think is really interesting because you see a lot of memes where people be like, DJing is, you know, we're a culture of listeners, and it's like, that's ableist in a very literal way. So absolutely thinking, yeah, so excellent point. Yeah, we'll come on to Dman.
I also, just similar to what you were saying, I'm also autistic, struggle with like chronic pain and stuff, so have really big issues with like concentration and stuff, but part of the way that I learned to DJ was with records. So that you feel the groove, you feel it's that thing, the sensation of it was always very important for me. So it was a much bigger aspect. And like when I was getting into DJing, people were like, "Oh, like if you're just looking at the head-up display, like that's you're not really DJing, are you? You're not really a DJ, like you don't like."
I don't really DJ. No,
Yeah.
that's the secret.
Yeah, this is the secret. None of us are DJs.
None of us are DJs. We're all just sat here.
Yeah. It's all pre-recorded. But to get back to the question, this is something as especially like in the future, my dream is to open a venue, so this is something I've thought about quite a lot. And it's one of those things to get that like ground floor, always ground floor venue, like ground floor multi-purpose spaces with like always a separate room from whatever is the interpreted club space, so that there is a quiet space, so that there is there's a venue we're going to be working with soon, which has like booths which are like soundproofed, which you can just go and sit in them. Like that's I wouldn't have ever thought about that. Like, it was only through like maybe having a conversation with them about like, oh, this is actually used for like co-working space, but it could be repurposed as like an accessibility feature. But I think also like when you talk about like sound systems, like something like when you go to Cosmic Slop and the sound system is pitch perfect, but there is that level of bass, but you could still talk to the person next to you. You don't necessarily need earplugs, like, but still have those earplugs provided, have like protective glasses provided, so that if you are like visually impaired, if you struggle with certain colours, with certain lights, you have that protective amount of just all these like accessibility features. But yeah, I think it's also another thing to get back with what I was saying earlier is like, I think also pricing should go into this. So it's like, is it affordable for you to access as like a punter or as a promoter? Are the drinks an affordable price? Are there decent soft drinks? Are there caffeinated beverages which you can enjoy if you don't drink? Like, I think I could ramble for days about
I mean,
this.
you're not rambling. Those are some really, really good points. So something then also that we've all been touching on is this idea that, you know, as much fun as it would be if we could kind of make any venue exactly what we wanted, again, there is that kind of, you know, upper level where a kind of barrier comes in, and often that, you know, it requires us to work, I guess, in groups. It requires us to kind of come together in various, you know, coalitions, and often within that, we're kind of forced to kind of defend, I guess, or not defend, but put the case forward for what we want to do as promoters, right? So sometimes when you go into a venue, for instance, I also do a lot of stuff around gender and trying to get kind of, you know, more trans people into club spaces. Well, not get more trans people into club spaces, but like make club spaces more welcoming to trans people, I guess.
We're here, we're waiting.
Yeah. Just me looking past every trans person I know in club spaces. But yeah, so, and you know, part of that is always that we always want to have gender neutral kind of toilet facilities, and you know, that is always a kind of discussion and a half, and you know, sometimes, you know, that goes well, and you know, this dovetails with discussions around bouncers and security too that you were talking about, Ali. So I guess another thing I wanted to touch on then was when it comes to those moments when the things that we want, you know, they aren't being received exactly as we want them to, or maybe the people who are in control of the venue just don't want you to do it. How do we have those kind of or what tips do you have to have those kind of more difficult conversations where you kind of maybe have to argue a point or potentially do, put something forward that the venue is like, no, we don't want you to do that.
So I actually have a specific example for something like that. So part of what I do for a job is like repping gigs, and so I was working, there's an artist called Gordian Stimm, who is a non-binary artist, and they are very, very passionate about this kind of, specifically around gender, the kind of thing of, making sure that everybody at the gig feels like as safe as possible and feels like they can express themselves as much as possible. So one of, it was illustrated in the advancing for the gig as somewhat of like a red line in terms of we have to have gender neutral toilets kind of thing. We have to have that kind of space. And it actually became a peculiar position where, as a trans woman, I was almost in a way arguing against having gender neutral toilet facilities, in the sense where, because it was at Belgrave Music Hall on a Saturday when Leeds had played at home, and I believe it was payday the day before as well.
Perfect
So there was a lot of lights knocking about, and it got to the point where I kind of had to say, like, yeah, I had to kind of be like, well, we're actually not gonna put signs up saying that that the men's toilets or the women's toilets are gender neutral, because it's almost, we felt it would be more constructive just to kind of stick to the line that we have in that venue anyway, which is we have these really, really good posters from the Good Night Out campaign, which just says, choose and use the loo that feels right for you, and there's not going to be a problem, kind of thing. It almost kind of becomes a situation where it's like, for all intents and purposes, it is gender neutral kind of thing. But like, if it then becomes a situation where, because of the unfortunate and very vitriolic and frankly fascistic discourse around trans people and gender incongruence going on in the UK at the minute, it then becomes a situation where, like, if some lad sees a sign saying gender neutral toilets, it almost becomes like a bit of like, oh, like, you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, definitely. So at one of my first nights out in Leeds, I kind of went to a kind of student thing because I was a fresher. Those heady days. And
Down it.
And I was kind of being approached by this security person that I didn't really feel comfortable with. And me and my friend were like, okay, so to try and get out of the heat, we're going to go into the kind of one gender neutral facility we could find. But basically what we realized is that by doing that, they kind of knew exactly where I was, because there was only one gender neutral facility in that kind of space. So absolutely, one of the things that I really will stress is that when it comes to accessibility, there are by no means always the most straightforward solutions, because it can get very complicated like that. And one thing I just want to add on there is that, just for anyone who, I want people to know, there are no legal requirements around bathrooms in this country. So on a very technical note, all bathrooms in this country are gender neutral. So if you ever see anyone who you think doesn't belong in a certain bathroom, keep it quiet, because that's not your decision, honeys. Anyone in this country can use whatever bathroom they would like. But absolutely, the kind of politics of navigating how do we communicate that, not just kind of have it be gender neutral, but communicate it for people's safety is super important. Really excellent. Cool. So then I was going to come to Ali, so do you want to?
Hi. Yes, I think one of the reasons that people respond negatively, or from my experience I've had, I'm quite vocal about it, and a lot of my friends are like, they run house nights, not really used to like having these big conversations about accessibility, and like they're great, but there is, because they're not aware of everything. And when I first came to uni, it was the first time I'd like been away from home. It was the first time I'd really drank. It was the first time I'd been out, really, because I was so poorly when I was younger. So I just didn't really tell anyone for a year, and then I became quite sick because I did that. So don't do that. I then had to start telling people, and it became this whole thing of like me like admitting part of myself instead of just accepting it for who I am. So now when I speak to my friends about all stuff like this, they understand it because they've been through it with me. So I think it's us talking about it in a safe environment, but there are obviously so many times where you can't, and even in ways that you don't even think. Like I would say something and I think people would think they're being nice, and they'd be like, oh wow, I could never go through that. And it's like, I'm not really going through it, I'm just living my life. So I think people don't quite understand it. So the more representation we have and the more we do things like this and the more that we talk about it, maybe the more people understand and we can get to that place.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I have a similar story in that one time when I told someone I was autistic, their response was to clap me on the shoulder. I didn't know this person. I'd met them literally 5 minutes before this happened. They clapped me on the shoulder and went, "You're so brave."
Yeah, you're
Bearing
so
in mind,
brave.
I had only told them...
Such a classic.
Such a classic. And
It
bear
is
in mind,
indeed a classic.
yeah, I had only told them that I was autistic because I didn't want them to talk to me. So, like, odd swings and roundabouts. So again, if you see a disabled person, maybe try not to tell them they're brave, apropos of absolutely nothing, because it does often come off as, always comes off as quite condescending. And as you've just heard, we all think it's a bit of a classic, really. So yeah, absolutely.
It's another thing that, like, especially I got diagnosed when I was 19, so I got diagnosed very late, and always happy to be like, oh, we knew there was something a bit different about you, a bit weird, a bit queer, and then whenever I started telling people, it would be a bit like, oh, well, you're too social, Dman. You're too high functioning. You're too whatever my preconception of a neurodivergent is. You're too neurotypical to be that. And I remember having a really quite like uncomfortable experience where I was like coming out to someone about being autistic. They're like, oh no, because you're high functioning, you have Asperger's. And me being like, I'm really not. And the person was saying this because they work with SEN kids. And it was a thing that really knocked me back quite a bit. Like, it was like, oh, maybe I don't get to identify. Maybe I don't get to choose. Even though I've gone through a 3-year-long process of getting diagnosed, maybe this person is right. Maybe I'm not autistic enough. But it's one of those things that I really struggle to have these kind of conversations with people, because I think this is probably what you lot will say as well. It's just us. It's just me. It's just a way that enables me to live my life a bit easier. But especially as an extension of that, like when it comes to having these awkward conversations with like bouncers, or with like when I first started running nights, I'd give like a letter to each bouncer, and I'd be like, can you just read through this and like maybe take this into account a bit, how you act throughout the night, and like same with the venue staff. And I kind of stopped doing that because all the venues I did that at, no one really did anything to do with it. I literally saw bouncers like screwing it up and putting it in the bin. And this is like bouncers that I'd worked with for like 4 years. And it's one of those things, yeah, maybe I'm wrong with it.
Just to kind of carry on from that thread, I mean, that's something in the band I play in, I Told You I'd Eat You. Yeah. We include that in all of our venue advancing as well. So it's because I mean, a lot of, as you can probably imagine, a lot of our like fans are like trans kids, and like kids who are like, you know, we try to make all of our shows, or as many of our shows, as underage, all ages even as possible, and also make sure that there's no like strobing effects used at any point during the performance, anything like that. We're really upfront with it. And you know what happens like with advancing with gigs and stuff like that, people very rarely actually read the emails, and it almost becomes a point.
Any emails you send
ever,
by the way, when you plan events, it doesn't matter how many you send, it doesn't matter how urgent you put this in the subject.
WhatsApp.
You better plan for a reading rate of about 5%.
And it's really like frustrating when that exact kind of thing happens, when like, you know, we've been really upfront, we've been like almost to the point of belligerence, like with it, and then it becomes kind of, just to like kind of cycle back what you were saying, when you kind of tell people that you're autistic, it then becomes a matter of kind of shame. Yeah. And I think that's a massive thing in terms of like when we're talking about accessibility. We need to kind of take the initiative to kind of take that that possibility of the people who do have the accessibility needs, to avoid them feeling any kind of shame about raising their voice. Because at the end of the day, like, we all want as many people to do as much stuff as possible, kind of thing. We don't want anybody to feel shameful in any way for trying to get the kind of things that they need, because we all want to live in that kind of egalitarian society. Well, I mean, at least I do, like, you know.
I hope we all do.
Good.
Just going back to what you said about not being autistic enough, I was talking about this today. It's always been something that I've had, and it's almost like a chip on my shoulder of not being healthy enough for my healthy friends, but not being disabled enough for my disabled friends, because physically you wouldn't see anything wrong with me. It would only ever be if I was in hospital or having a really bad flare-up that you'd see that, and it just almost made my heart happy that I heard you say that, because I felt that my whole life.
You go.
I also relate a lot to that, because
Yeah.
it was a similar thing where I was like, oh, it's that thing of hidden disabilities, where it's like, I have chronic pain, I have plates in my legs, whatever, but it's like, I'm not quite disabled enough to be disabled.
Yeah, it's the Rain Man thing. Isn't it? So it's like,
You must have a superpower.
Autism gang. I have autism as well, and it's one of those things where like when I tell people, they'd be like, oh, I could never tell, kind of thing. It's just like, yeah, because I grew up like masking in front of everyone, kind of thing, because I fucking had to.
Yeah.
You know, like, so it's not that you can't tell, it's that I was pressured into trying to pretend that I was neurotypical for bloody ages.
And it's exhausting. Like,
Yeah, it sucks, man.
keeping up, like at school, and that when I said about my first year of uni, not telling anyone, I was so tired, like just exhausted. And then when I did have that like moment, where I was like, actually, this is a part of me, and like people give you advice where it's like, oh, it's not your whole thing, like it's just an illness, it'll go, blah 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 blah. Like that doesn't actually help you deal with it. It helps you hide it, which was really, really bad for me. And when I started opening up and talking about it and being very vocal about how we need to be better, especially through COVID, which was absolutely horrendous, like that for me made me feel more whole, because I'd accepted this part of me that had been in there for like 10 years without me ever admitting it. So I think making spaces safe for everyone to talk about it, and that reaction that we can get from bouncers and things like that, and bar staff, and like I have friends that own clubs and friends that are bouncers, and I'll speak to them about like accessibility and they'll roll their eyes, and it's like a whole thing, they don't want to talk about it. And it's, but how do you have that conversation? Because I'm one person, I can't change like 3 blokes' minds that are stood on the door.
Did you want to say something? No? Yeah, so I mean, one of the hard conversations I once had to have was someone at Flesh and Tension was coming up to me and was like, I would like a red wristband. So if you've not been to Flesh and Tension, it basically means that you only really came there to hang out with the people you came with, and you don't really want anyone else to be approaching you. And a girl, a woman behind them even, really loudly was like, oh, why would anyone, because we had them all written like up so people knew what they were, and they really loudly were like, oh, why would anyone want a red wristband? Why would you come out and not want to talk to people? And I, again, using the quote-unquote autistic superpower of bluntness, decided to jump straight in there and be like, because they may have social anxiety or trauma or you know, autism, like me. And then, you know, I find that sometimes when you're blunt on the scene, that actually will get some traction. But absolutely, I definitely agree. I think there is so much normativity that can be fallen back on, I guess, when you do try to raise these things. So something I often get said to me when I try to bring up like, autism in clubbing spaces or making clubbing spaces more autistic friendly is constantly people will be like, but autistic people do not want to go out, so why would we try? Why would we bother trying to make spaces for autistic people?
Absolute bollocks.
Right?
Yeah.
Evidently, considering we've somehow formed the majority on this panel
Yeah.
and now have full control.
I think that's a very interesting thing there as well, because it's like so much of my first experience of seeing nights that were made for quote unquote disabled people was that pure tokenistic and just very much like there used to be that night at Tiger, which this is years and years and years and years ago. It was basically a very well-meaning night, which was, I think it was like one night out of a month, and it would be for quite low-functioning, quite I don't know how to say this in a way without being offensive to anyone, but
People with very complex needs.
yes, yeah, that's the people with very complex needs and their carers, and that was my first experience of seeing a night made for disabled people or differently abled people, and I remember going to it once and being like, this is so uncomfortable, and being like, why would anyone who's disabled or like someone with even slightly less complex needs want to go to something like this? Like, or why would anyone seeing this want to go and make something for the less complexly able people after seeing something like that? Like, it's, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess following that, I guess with a surprise follow-up question, which is odd for me because again, the autism. So then I guess how do we feel about the importance of not only spaces becoming more accessible, but those movements to accessibility being driven by disabled people themselves, rather than you said it being a tokenistic decision on, you know, largely non-disabled organisers? How do you feel as a panel about the idea that the claim that in order for it to be truly accessible, disabled people have to kind of be in the organising room, have to be in the formation of it? Who wants to go take that one?
For me, that kind of accidentally kind of like broaches like a wider question about just how in general in this, well, in our society we view people who are differently abled and people who do have different needs, kind of thing. Because my first impulse when you said that was to think of, oh right, well the people that have like the money and the resources should be, you know, striving to give disabled people with disabilities kind of more kind of free reign to do that kind of thing. And then I was like, well actually being disabled in this country is really shit, really difficult. Because, you know, we live in this culture of austerity and we live in this we're kind of in this like strange Victorian, you know, Ayn Randian, every man for himself, fuck you, I've got mine kind of mindset, which is just the absolute worst. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, it's almost like kind of being able to do these like grassroots things and like being able to do as much as we can to like give people who are differently abled that ability to like do their thing is unfortunately kind of, in lieu of the Conservative government that we've got at the moment, kind of all that we can really do. But yeah, I think it is a matter of recognizing the kind of sea change at large that needs to happen within like disabled people's rights. And, you know, it's you know, the rights of people with like mental like disabilities as well, and like kind of the rights of people who are mentally ill kind of thing. And you know, I'm gonna stop now because I'm gonna start talking about Foucault and all that bullshit.
No, I mean, definitely, but I mean, so I've got two comments to add on to that as the host. So one is we're 50 years into the Thatcher experiment and it's still failing. And then, so the second one I really want to touch there is that idea, right, that so it's not, we should recognise then as a panel about accessibility that the UK is almost singularly amongst other countries right now kind of being talked to at an international level as a place that is hostile towards disabled people. So when we talk about accessibility, this is by no means a superficial or frivolous thing to be discussing. It is actually vital because, you know, disabled people are one of the groups who the government really do just think they can go after. So definitely. Ali, did you want?
I also think that there's like two parts to it. One where you want spaces that are completely for people that have that need, and then there's also how do we integrate the two? Like how do we make it so that you don't have to go to a specifically, or maybe making those nights good enough that you want to go to them, because some, like you said, some of them aren't very good. But how do we integrate everyone like together when it's safe and fair to do so, if that's what you want? I think like how do we make spaces like the clubs in Leeds better for everyone and like more comfortable so that you're not missing out on like the DJs that you like to see or the bands that you like to see, and you're not being put into one space. But then equally, if you need one space, then we should have those too. I think we just need more options. Like it shouldn't be that you can only go to these clubs and you can only go when it's not busy because you might get turned away. Like there needs to be more.
100%. Like I think it's such a complex thing saying should this be led exclusively by differently abled people, exclusively by disabled people. But I think no matter what, be or end all, we have to be a part of that discussion. We have to like, just like even as someone with autism, I get very caught up in making things accessible just based on my tunnel vision of autism. I forget sometimes that there's different perspectives outside that. There's different there's other ways that I can make things accessible. There's people with physical impairments. There's people with like hearing impairment. Like there's such a wide spectrum, and so I think the only way that we can successfully make this scene accessible for all and inclusive for all, and make the spaces integrated, is by, like we were talking about earlier, like a community, like a cohesive organisation, an alliance of disabled people. Otherwise, we will just keep having small pockets, which the small pockets are great. The small pockets are really fun, and there's lots of small minority organisations and small minority communities that have some of the best club nights in the world, some of the most accessible stuff in the world. But until we have an alliance, we're never going to get a fully inclusive and kind of like, we're never going to get that egalitarian society that we want. Like we're just gonna keep fighting our little battles like Thatcher wants us to.
Absolutely.
Like we're still gonna be fighting those individualistic battles that neoliberalism tells us to fight.
I'm trying really hard not to make the Thatcher gender-neutral bathroom joke right now.
Make it.
Go ahead.
Go right ahead.
Oh, it's like
I want to hear it.
Thatcher's grave is a gender-neutral bathroom. Thank you, Gala.
So on that note, we're going to go on to the fourth question, lest the Leeds Tory Association descend upon us. So I think we've talked enough about what we're doing. And so the fourth question, I guess, I really wanted to generate some focus on the audience, so to speak. Let's break the fourth wall. So reflecting then on how building on these kind of coalitions, building on this organisation that we've talked about, which is so essential, what kind of things do you think the audience could go away thinking about or doing to kind of help build on the accessibility movement you see happening in the club scene? Kind of what would be some of the ways they could get involved?
I kind of wrote quite a bit about this.
Go on.
It was something that I'm always keen to push people to, because I'm not very good at pushing myself, so I'll just push other people to do it for me. So it's like, part of what I wrote down was like, question your promoters, question your venue management. As people who aren't differently able to have some of those difficult, awkward conversations that we really sometimes struggle to have. Get people to push those boundaries for yourself. Question new venues about their policies. Try to build spaces that are not just for yourself, but are for everyone else. And like, in the same way as you would with any minority organisation, be an ally. Like, just be there and be a good person.
Yeah. Like, if you are cis and, you know, able-bodied and neurotypical, like, it's time to show up. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's enough, there's lots of stuff going around about, like, kind of visibility at the moment, but visibility is nothing without actual like material change and material differences. And the best people, the people who are best equipped to do that are the people that are kind of in those positions of privilege that actually have, you know, it's the whole kind of principle where, like, you know, you put your money where your mouth is kind of thing. So if you are able-bodied and you are cis and you are like do exactly what Dman said. Like, go to your promoters, be like, yo, what's up with this? Like, what's this, like, massive 3-story staircase or whatever? Kind of, I don't know, that's a bad example, but yeah, you know what I'm saying. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, sometimes in the scene, there's this weird pedestalization of the promoters and DJs and event runners, I guess. And I mean, not to out my own position here as all three of those things. But absolutely, we are kind of there in many ways to be critiqued, to have those things brought to us. So absolutely, you know, and this kind of culture that has kind of developed, which is, oh, but you shouldn't, because, you know, they're the cool ones, we should try and acquiesce them. No, they're the ones running the event for you. So just want to really double down on this. Do question the promoters, take that conversation to them. Alex?
It's also, like, touching on what you both said, it's exhausting being disabled. Like, there's been so many times where I've had to fight, like, people that I thought were my friends because of their views, and this scene has a very bad point of view on medicine. There's a lot of stuff around that on Facebook all the time, and I see people who I think are, like, have been incredible friends saying that, like, you don't need to take antibiotics, but without antibiotics I would have died. So they're very, very, very important to some people. And I think it's just thinking about who sees what you're posting, if you are posting stuff like that. They're like, you don't know everyone's story. People will be feeling that way. They'll see it and it'll hurt. And then also talking to people and like coming to things like this is very good, and listening to what people in these positions have to say.
I also want to double down on that. So many, especially post lockdown, and especially over lockdown, as someone who was like clinically extremely vulnerable, and probably other people can relate to this. Please don't tell me that you can cure my illness. Like, please don't tell me that you can cure
Go for a walk.
Yeah, go for a walk. That'll cure. Or maybe you shouldn't have got the MMR vaccine.
Yeah.
Maybe you wouldn't be autistic. Or maybe just so much stuff like this where it's like, oh, you don't need antibiotics. Your body could fix itself. Or maybe if it couldn't, you don't really deserve to be here. Like.
Yeah. And it might be getting away from the point slightly, but I do think it's very, very worth noting that all of that kind of stuff, all of the anti-vax stuff, and that kind of area of stuff, all very much and very, very materially has its roots deep within fascism.
And anti-Semitism.
And yeah, exactly. So that kind of stuff, maybe
maybe don't spread it about.
Yeah.
And our scene is it gets quite close to it, like, because there's a lot of very spiritual people they're like same side of the coin, whatever the expression is. You can get very, very close to it, and like I've seen people go from like starting to meditate into, if you like, I don't want to stay at home anymore, I don't care if you die from COVID, like that progression happened very quickly. So it's, if you see people doing that, like, it's exhausting for me to call that out, like call it out. Please.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the great ironies, and I say this as an autistic person, is that often, you know, when it comes to having the hard conversation, it falls upon someone who, you know, the state has said I have a social communication disorder. So, you know, you might not think that we should really be the ones being left with all these hard conversations, but at the same time, we often are. So, yeah, I really can't stress how important it is as allies, I guess, to be putting kind of your voice behind these discussions too, and kind of taking on, like I said, that discomfort, taking on that quote unquote shame of defending, for instance, you know, disabled people who often our people society kind of is happy to say are kind of quote unquote worthless, right? You know, we talk about the anti-vax stuff. What I think about when I think about the anti-vax stuff is the fact that, you know, there are many, frankly, mothers out there who are very happy to say that they would rather their children be dead than they have autism, right? So that is how extreme. And so the idea that vaccines give autism, for a lot of mothers, that makes them not give their kids vaccines. You know, we really can't overlook the kind of quite violent ableism inherent in some of this, actually, that like Ali says, as we've all mentioned, it is really exhausting to have to deal with, because you're very aware in those moments that they are very personally talking about you.
Yeah, I think, and it's one of those things as well, as you said, you can't take anything like that as anything but an attack.
Yeah.
Like, it is an attack. It is, like, even if someone says it's not personal, even if it's one thing that I hear this about, like, various, like, I'll be having a conversation with someone and then they'll be like, oh, like, so-and-so in the scene's anti-vax, just very casually. And it's like, it's one of those things, like with any sort of allyship, like with any sort of, it's on us to hold the people that we surround ourselves and the people that we hold part of the scene accountable. Just anyone who's part of the scene, it's on us all to hold each other accountable. Like, yeah, I think that's quite important.
And also, just following on from that, I think it's as well, like, from an organisational standpoint, I think it's very much on the people that run these spaces, when that kind of stuff is called out, to actually make sure that there is like an actual robust and tangible accountability process in place, kind of thing. So if there is a situation where, like, somebody has tried to come to a club night or a gig or whatever, and somebody has physically not been able to access the space, like, it's on the promoter or the venue manager or whatever to try and make sure that that is, like, addressed and that people are held accountable for that kind of thing, because otherwise it's just, okay, that's really shit and it's shit and that's it. And it's like, no, we need to do better than that, you know?
And I mean, this is such a huge part of it, because also, you know, as disabled people often, as a disabled person myself, making plans on where to go out, I often will think, you know, well, if that event doesn't have a kind of mechanism to deal with this, why would I go? But the reality is, if something then happened, it wouldn't, you know, there would not be a clear cut or easy way for that to be resolved. It would once again come down to the disabled individual in question, you know, potentially with people, potentially not with people, having to take that against people who, you know, their interests are, but this event is great, this event is good, this event is what we want it to be. So definitely, yeah. Cool. Awesome. Cool. So we've got 5 minutes left of the panel. So I guess final word on accessibility. Yeah, we'll just, I'll let it be a freestyle. I guess if you had one tagline, if you had one tagline to end on about accessibility, what would it be?
Oh God.
Reminds me of when I used to teach seminars, everyone's avoiding my gaze.
Yeah, this is like asking a lot of autistic people.
So I'll leave.
Tagline for me would be...
I've got one.
Go.
Don't leave it up to the people who need accessibility to organise accessibility. Like, it's not for them to organise, because it should already be there, is kind of the thing. It's kind of like similar to what I said at the very start, where it's like, you need to kind of take a step back and really recontextualise whatever you're doing and be like, okay, instead of who is this for, think about who am I keeping out? And that can be for like literally for any kind of like subset or like social strata of like whatever kind of person you're looking at. So yeah, I guess that would be my tagline.
Okay, I
Bit
got
of a fucking
one.
long tagline, isn't it?
Mine is more for people living with long-term conditions, is that if you're able to, like, getting out there is so good. Like, it was so good for me to like make that leap, but it was the most terrifying thing. And when we have these like accessibility measures in place and more people are able to do that, like, it made me have a life that the average 20-year-old had, and it was so important that I could do that.
I'd say maybe I also back what you're saying, Ali, because I don't think I'd be the person I am today if I hadn't tried to fucking get outside that. But I'd say like I lost my train of thought. Like, support your local, like, audibly support your local disabled people. Support your local disabled DJs. Support like it's all we always say it's really good to support your local creatives, to support your local whoever's doing stuff in the scene. But I think it's one of those things, especially as disabled people, differently able people, there's a lot more of the world trying to tell us that we don't belong. So maybe just every now and then give us an extra, just like, we love you. Have a good,
Thumbs up.
Yeah, just you're doing great, sweetie.
Just one very last thing that I wanted to mention, just on a personal level as well. So I was in the closet for 10 years, and I finally came out as a trans woman in September 2019. And Flesh and Tension on the 2nd of November 2019 was the first time I ever went out. For whatever, God knows what fucking reason, I went on my own. And genuinely, like, the space that you were able, like, to create there was just, like mind-blowing isn't even the fucking half of it. Like, it was so beautiful and, like, life-changing to be able to be in a space where, like, firstly, the coloured wristband thing, absolutely genius. Like, there's, like, I know people that have organised parties, like, across the UK that have, like, when they've asked about stuff like that, I've actually been like, oh, well, there's this party called Flesh and Tension that do this kind of thing. And the fact that there was, like, a room that was a quiet space, that was a chill-out space, the way that, like, the sound system wasn't massively, like, too loud, the way that there wasn't any kind of strobing effects or anything like that, anything that's going to make you have sensory overload, the fact that, like, the security were all properly briefed and stuff like that, and all, you know, for the most part, for what I experienced, like, you know, just safe dudes. Like, it was amazing. And yeah, as far as I'm concerned, you're an absolute legend, like, for doing that. So, like, you're for me personally, not to, like, butt you up too much, but, like, you're kind of like the watermark for actually doing that, you know? But yeah.
You heard it, folks. I didn't say it myself, but I am a legend.
No, I don't care if it's cringy. Like, I genuinely mean it.
And I'm glad that we achieved our aims, because that was,
definitely.
that was absolutely the aims. We wanted to make it a really great space for disabled people, trans and non-binary people, people of colour. So I'm really glad we could nail it. Just want to add my own final tagline in there, because it's something that I feel often gets missed out when we're talking about disabled people, which is remember in your interactions with us that we are human like you. We have just as complicated a life and emotional internal world, even if we have conditions that some say mean we don't, autism, we do. So, remember in your interactions with us that we are people too, and we are complicated as well. So it's not always just a case of thinking, well, because I've heard of one thing to do with this disability, I therefore can kind of tell this disabled person about their condition, which is something that does happen very commonly. But yeah, so I want to also give a big, huge thanks to the panelists. You were all awesome. You had some really excellent ideas. And that's 9, everyone. You're all legends to me as well. So I do believe that now we are having like a Q&A segment very briefly. Sorry, I thought people were raising their hands at me against the light.
For those of you watching at home, just a sea of hands have just all.
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for our esteemed panelists?
That's a no.
Yes.
What would you say is the most accessible venue in Leeds, just on a general level? I'm probably going to aim that at Dman, just the whole panel, but I'll start off with you.
So I'd straight up say Sheaf Street.
Yeah.
But then I've never actually been able to access it because.
I don't think you can say that.
This is like purely from an accessibility perspective, not taking in accounts or actually hiring the venue. Sheaf Street. There is wheelchair accessibility through the space. There is a separate cafe space. There were 2 disabled toilets, I believe. It is all on one floor. Drinks are more on the expensive price, but I'd love to hire the place out, but pricing wise it's too much. There was a lengthy form online which I filled off and probably came across like a dickhead, because I'm not very good at typing out extensive forms. I didn't have a great high school experience. If any of you guys want to comment about accessibility?
Wharf Chambers is an incredible community-led space where there is a project space on the middle floor, which I think may or may not be separate to it. But yeah, so the ground floor is all completely accessible. Drinks are really cheap. It's really, really cheap to hire out. It's basically run by a bunch of trans people, which is awesome. They have pretty much every kind of event you could ever think of there as well. The great thing about it is that you can literally just go into Wharf and just go to the bar and just be like, hey, what's the email of the person that organizes the calendar here? And they'll give you it, and then you email them with the date, and then if it's free, you get it, kind of thing. So it's
still like £50, isn't it?
Something like that, yeah. It's absolutely
£50
it's cheap as chips.
Yeah.
You get an engineer as well.
Yeah.
So.
I was going to say Sheaf Street too, so.
Sheaf Street wins. It's official.
It's the award. Sandwich right now.
I do back Wharf though, because Wharf for Leeds, I think, is kind of the gold standard. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that, in another way, nowadays, Wharf, everyone knows about Wharf.
Yeah.
So it is booked. It is booked very far in advance. And especially because they were trying to survive lockdown, they took all the bookings. So I think there's still a conversation to be had currently about how Wharf will protect both the punters that go there and the staff members that are working there.
I mean, because one of the things I really like about Wharf Chambers as well is that there's no security there, which might on the face of it seem like a really, really bad idea, but it's, for the same reason why I think it's a good thing that there's no security at Wharf, for the same reason why I'm against things like, why I'm in favour of police abolition, kind of thing, because it's, communities banding together is always going to be so much stronger than kind of like relying on someone in a kind of abject powered kind of position. So
I back that. And I also believe in abolition of police.
there you go.
But I do think with WARF there needs to be some more safeguarding things in place. Just because there has been a couple of times recently where I've been at WARF where I have felt unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably the first time I've ever had that.
Yeah.
Having been like paying to be a member of WARF since I was like 17. So I think it's all these things that are part of the conversation, aren't they?
For sure.
Yeah, and I mean, so I was letting that go on because I think that was a really excellent kind of snippet of that is how a lot of disabled people do discuss like your venues, your parties. We have these conversations, you know, don't think that we kind of just turn up and, you know, and then don't exist when we go. We do still exist, so we are, you know, I think it was a really excellent kind of snippet there. Thank you. So do we have any other questions from the audience for the esteemed panel? I'm not seeing any hands. Is anyone else?
No,
This is
I'm
where
not
we-
seeing hands.
Wait a minute. No, there's no hands.
Cool. Then I do feel confident calling that a wrap on this panel. The future of accessibility is over. Sorry, everyone.
You don't have to go home,
We
but you
did
can't
that.
stay here.
We really did
Thatcher
that.
ruined it for us all. No hope.
But yeah. So. Yeah. Thanks. I'm not really sure how to
Thank
end
you,
this. So
Gala.
I'll just...
Yeah, thank you.
Gavin.
Thanks everyone for watching.
Really hot.
Yeah, I'm really sweating.
Killed it.
Killed it. Thanks for being excellent panelists.
Amazing.
This was really good.
What can I say? I'm fantastic.
Yeah, that's cool.
I'm not
Flew
walking
like
like
that.
that. I've not
Yeah,
even dropped that.